Reform Judaism is a major confessional division within Judaism, which emphasizes the evolving nature of the religion, the superiority of its ethical aspects compared to the ceremonial ones, and a belief in a continuous revelation not centered on the theophany at Mount Sinai. It is characterized by a lesser stress on ritual and personal observance, regarding Jewish law as of basically non-binding nature, and great openness to external influences and progressive values. The origins of Reform Judaism lay in 19th-century Germany, where its early principles were formulated by Rabbi Abraham Geiger and his associates, and its greatest center today is in North America. Reform Judaism, as a proper term, specifically refers to two denominations: the American Union for Reform Judaism and the British Movement for Reform Judaism, along with other regional branches sharing the same basic convictions, such as British Liberal Judaism. They are members of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, founded in 1926. Reconstructionist Judaism, espousing an unrelated doctrine, entered the Union in 1990. Definitions: the inherent pluralism and great importance it places on individual autonomy impede any simplistic definition of Reform Judaism. Its various strands regard Judaism throughout the ages as derived from a process of constant evolution. They warrant and obligate further modification, and reject any fixed, permanent set of beliefs, laws or practices. A clear description became particularly challenging since the turn toward a policy favoring inclusiveness over a coherent theology in the 1970s. This largely overlapped with what researchers termed as the transition from classical to new reform in America, paralleled in the other, smaller branches across the world. The movement ceased stressing principles and core beliefs, focusing more on the personal spiritual experience. This shift was not accompanied by a distinct new theology or by the abandonment of the former, but rather with ideological ambiguity, as the leadership allowed and encouraged a wide variety of positions, from selective adoption of halachic observance to elements approaching religious humanism. The declining importance of the theoretical foundation, in favor of pluralism and equivocalness, did draw large crowds of newcomers. It also diversified reform to a degree which made it hard to formulate a clear definition of it. Early and classical reform were characterized by a move away from traditional forms of Judaism. New reform sought, to a degree, the reincorporation of some within the framework established during the former stages. Theology, God in regards to God. While some voices among the spiritual leadership approached religious and even secular humanism, a tendency that grew increasingly from the mid-20th century, both among clergy and constituents, leading to broader, dimmer definitions of the concept. The movement had always officially maintained a theistic stance, affirming the belief in a personal God. Early Reform thinkers in Germany clung to this precept. The 1885 Pittsburgh Platform described the one God, the God idea as taught in our sacred scripture, as consecrating the Jewish people to be its priests, and was grounded on a wholly theistic understanding, though the term God idea was excoriated by outside critics. So was the 1937 Columbus Declaration of Principles, which spoke of a one living God who rules the world. Even the 1976 San Francisco Centenary Perspective, drafted at a time of great discord among Reform theologians, upheld the affirmation of God. Challenges of modern culture have made steady belief difficult for some. Nevertheless, we ground our lives, personally and communally, on God's reality. The 1999 Pittsburgh Statement of Principles declared the reality and oneness of God. British Liberal Judaism affirms the Jewish conception of God. one, an indivisible, transcendent and immanent, creator and sustainer. Revelation. The basic tenet of Reformed theology is a belief in a continuous, or progressive, revelation, occurring continuously and not limited to the theophany at Sinai, the defining event in traditional interpretation. According to this view, all Holy Scripture of Judaism, including the Pentateuch, were authored by human beings who, though under divine inspiration, inserted their understanding and reflected the spirit of their consecutive ages. All the people of Israel are a further link in the chain of revelation, capable of reaching new insights. Religion can be renewed without necessarily being dependent on past conventions. The chief promulgator of this concept was Rabbi Abraham Geiger, generally considered founder of the movement. After critical research led him to regard Scripture as a human creation, bearing the marks of historical circumstances, he abandoned the belief in the unbroken perpetuity of tradition, derived from Sinai, and gradually replaced it with the idea of progressive revelation. While also subject to change and new understanding, this basic premise endures in of Reformed thought. In its early days, this notion was greatly influenced the philosophy of German idealism, from which its founders drew much inspiration. Belief in humanity marching toward a full understanding of itself and the divine, manifested in moral progress towards perfection. And Claude Montefiore. This highly rationalistic view virtually identified human reason and intellect with divine action, leaving little room for direct influence by God. Geiger conceived revelation as occurring via the inherent genius of the people of Israel, and his close ally Solomon Formstecher described it as the awakening of oneself into full consciousness of one's religious understanding. The American theologian Kaufman Kohler also spoke of the special insight of Israel, almost fully independent from direct divine participation. And English thinker Claude Montefiore, founder of liberal Judaism, reduced revelation to inspiration, according intrinsic value only to the worth of its content, while it is not the place where they are found that makes them inspired, common to all. These notions was the assertion that present generations have a higher and better understanding of divine will, and they can and should unwaveringly change and refashion religious precepts. In the decades around World War II, this rationalistic and optimistic theology was challenged and questioned. It was gradually replaced mainly by the Jewish existentialism of Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, centered on a complex, personal relationship with the Creator, and a more sober and disillusioned outlook. The identification of human reason with godly inspiration was rejected in favor of views such as Rosenzweig's, who emphasized that the only content of revelation is it in itself, while all derivations of it are subjective, limited human understanding. However, while granting higher status to historical and traditional understanding, both insisted that revelation is certainly not law-giving, and that it did not contain any finished statements about God, but rather that human subjectivity shaped the unfathomable content of encounter and interpreted it under its own limitations. The senior representative of post-war Reformed theology, Eugene Borowitz, regarded theophany in postmodern terms and closely linked it with quotidian human experience and interpersonal contact. He rejected the notion of progressive revelation, in the meaning of comparing human betterment with divine inspiration, stressing that past experiences were unique and of everlasting importance. Yet he stated that his ideas did not at all negate the concept of ongoing revelation affecting all. Ritual, autonomy and law. Reformed Judaism emphasizes the ethical facets of the faith as its central attribute, superseding the ceremonial ones. Reformed thinkers often cited the prophets' condemnations of ceremonial acts, lacking true intention and performed by the morally corrupt, as testimony that rites have no inherent quality. Geiger centered his philosophy on the prophets' teachings regarding morality and ethics as the stable core of a religion in which ritual observance transformed radically through the ages. However, practices were seen as a means to elation and a link to the heritage of the past. and Reform generally argued that rituals should be maintained, discarded or modified based on whether they served these higher purposes. This stance allowed a great variety of practice both in the past and the present. In classical times, personal observance was reduced to little beyond nothing. The post-war New Reform lent renewed importance to practical, irregular action as a means to engage congregants, abandoning the sanitized forms of the classical. Another key aspect of Reform doctrine is the personal autonomy of each adherent, who may formulate his own understanding and expression of his religiosity. Reform is unique among all denominations in placing the individual as the authorized interpreter of Judaism. This position was originally influenced by Kantian philosophy and the great weight it lent to personal judgment and free will. This highly individualistic stance also proved one of the movement's great challenges, for it impeded the creation of clear guidelines and standards for positive participation in religious life and definition of what was expected from members. The notion of autonomy coincided with the gradual abandonment of traditional practice in the early stages of the movement. It was a major characteristic during the classical period, when Reform closely resembled Protestant surroundings, and later, was used to encourage adherents to seek their own means of engaging Judaism. New Reform embraced the criticism levied by Rosenzweig and other thinkers at extreme individualism, laying a greater stress on community and tradition, though by no means declaring that members were bound by a compelling authority of some sort. The New Reform approach to the question is characterized by an attempt to strike a mean between autonomy and conformity to some degree, focusing on a dialectic relationship between both. The movement never entirely abandoned halachic argumentation, both due to the need for precedent to counter external accusations and the continuity of heritage, but had largely made ethical considerations or the spirit of the age the decisive factor in determining its course. The German founding fathers undermined the principles behind the legalistic process, and Rabbi Samuel Holdheim advocated a particularly radical stance, arguing that the law of the land is law doctrine must be universally applied and subject virtually everything to current norms. While Reform rabbis in 19th-century Germany had to accommodate conservative elements in their communities, at the height of classical reform in the United States, halachic considerations could be virtually ignored and Holdheim's approach embraced. Later on, Rabbi Solomon Freehoff and his supporters reintroduced such elements, but they too regarded Jewish law as too rigid a system. Instead, they recommended that selected features will be readopted and new observances established in a piecemeal fashion, as spontaneous minhag emerging by trial and error and becoming widespread if it appealed to the masses. The advocates of this approach also stress that their responses are of non-binding nature, and their recipients may adapt them as they see fit. Freehoff's successors, such as Rabbis Walter Jacob and Moshe Zemer, further elaborated the notion of progressive halachah along the same lines. Messianic age and election reform sought to accentuate and greatly augment the universalist traits in Judaism, turning it into a faith befitting the Enlightenment ideals ubiquitous at the time it emerged. The tension between universalism and the imperative to maintain uniqueness characterized the movement throughout its entire history. Its earliest proponents rejected deism and the belief that all religions would unite into one, and it later faced the challenges of the ethical movement and Unitarianism. Parallel to that, it sought to diminish all components of Judaism which it regarded as overly particularist and self-centered. Petitions expressing hostility towards Gentiles were toned down or excised, and practices were often streamlined to resemble surrounding society. New Reform laid a renewed stress on Jewish particular identity, regarding it as better suiting popular sentiment and need for preservation. One major expression of that, which is the first clear Reformed doctrine to have been formulated, is the idea of universal messianism. The belief in redemption was unhinged from the traditional elements of return to Zion and restoration of the temple and the sacrificial cult therein, and turned into a general hope for salvation. This was later refined when the notion of a personal Messiah who would reign over Israel was officially abolished and replaced by the concept of a messianic age, of universal harmony and perfection. The considerable loss of faith in human progress around World War II had greatly shook this ideal, but it endures as a precept of reform. Another key example is the reinterpretation of the election of Israel. The movement maintained the idea of the chosen people of God, but recast it in a more universal fashion. The mission of Israel was to spread among all nations and teach him divinely inspired ethical monotheism, bringing them all closer to the Creator. One extreme, classical, promulgator of this approach, Rabbi David Einhorn, substituted the lamentation on the 9th of Av for a celebration, regarding the destruction of Jerusalem as fulfilling God's scheme to bring His word, via His people, to all corners of the earth. Highly self-centered affirmations of Jewish exceptionalism were moderated, though the general notion of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation retained. Soul and afterlife is part of its philosophy. Reform anchored reason in divine influence, accepted scientific criticism of hallowed texts and sought to adapt Judaism to modern notions of rationalism. In addition to the other traditional precepts its founders rejected, they also denied the belief in the future bodily resurrection of the dead. It was viewed both as irrational and an import from ancient Middle Eastern pagans. Notions of afterlife were reduced merely to the immortality of the soul. While the founding thinkers, like Montefiore, all shared this belief, the existence of a soul became harder to cling to with the passing of time. In the 1980s, Borowitz could state that the movement had nothing coherent to declare in the matter. The various streams of reform still largely, though not always or strictly, uphold the idea. The 1999 Pittsburgh Statement of Principles, for example, used the somewhat ambiguous formula, "The Spirit within us is eternal." Along these lines, the concept of reward and punishment in the world to come was abolished as well. The only perceived form of retribution for the wicked, if any, was the anguish of their soul after death, and vice versa. Bliss was the single accolade for the spirits of the righteous. Angels and heavenly hosts were also deemed a foreign superstitious influence, especially from early Zoroastrian sources, and denied.